So,
Mhm.
uh, Chris Green is our guest for this cohort module. I asked Chris to join us. Um, and so, to get started, so Chris, in our cohort, there are Lutherans of different stripes, there are Presbyterians, there is a Disciples of Christ, there's a few Episcopalians. Uh, there's no one who tracks exactly with your background. So I thought maybe it would be good just for you to kind of narrate your journey for folks so they can kind
Mhm.
of place you and get to know you. So go.
Sure. Focus specifically on preaching or just the broader spirituality?
Well, no, this is just like, who is Chris Green?
Hmm.
And how did you get from point A to where you are right now?
I'm one of the people who knows least about that journey. I've been a little bit too close to it. That's a question for my parents and my wife and my kids, probably. But
It's a very Herwasian answer, but
it is, isn't it? I find that I have debts to him I've not acknowledged, much less paid. But I think probably the place to start, much like Hauerwas, is I was an Oklahoman and a Pentecostal. So I grew up amongst sweat and blood Pentecostals in rural Oklahoma. My dad was a mechanic, having before been a police officer, having before been a Marine. All of that excellent training for fatherhood. And my mom worked for the newspaper. My grandfather, my mom's dad, lived and died, within a mile of he died within a mile of where he was born. Although he did travel some when he worked for the oil rig. So those are the people I grew up around, right? Very, very working class, intense Pentecostal spirituality. We were in church all the time, at least 4 times a week, every week, for hours every time. As I often say, every time we went, we put our bodies at hazard. Anything might happen. You know, it was it was a circus. It was, but more intense somehow because we really believed it. I mean, I can remember as a kid
mhm.
being convinced that the rapture was happening that night and that I was going to be left behind. So, like, desperately trying to find my parents and not being able to find them in the mayhem of the altar service because all the adults were caught up into the third heaven. And it was that kind of intensity. Years later, when I went to Bible school, which was itself a Pentecostal Bible school, the level of intensity was so low compared to what I had known. It didn't feel real. Like it didn't feel like church unless I thought I might die in my sins at the altar. And so that's what I grew up in. But I had no skills. Like, so I grew up, in that community. I knew from a very young age that I would be a preacher, although I didn't know exactly what that meant because I didn't know how to picture myself in that future. But there was that kind of tug. But I was also a strange kid. I had, again, no skills. I wasn't good at anything. And so it was, by the time I started to become an adult, it became clear pretty quickly I was going to have to go to school because I had no other options. Like, I could read, and that was it. And so I ended up at Bible school. I was too intimidated to try to go anywhere else and failed out. Like, I was so socially overwhelmed. It was Oklahoma City, but it might as well have been Paris for me. I mean, it was so much. I failed out and traveled with an evangelist for a year. That's a terrible story in its own right. When I'm old and dying, if I live long enough to die old, I'll write that in the memoir. I'm waiting for him to die before I write it. But the that was a lesson of its own for sure. And then while I was traveling with him, so at this point I'm 18, 19, I realized, yeah, I've got to go to school. That's what I can do. When I came back to school, then I had fallen in love with theology, started reading um, as seriously as I could, and started pursuing that life. After my senior year, I met Julie, who would be my wife. After we graduated, we started a church, and I started graduate school. And from that time, I've kind of been involved in the parish in one way and in the academy in another way consistently. So we planted that church. We were there for 11 years. Then I became a teaching pastor at another church while I was teaching full time, and then kind of continued that dance from that point. Most of those have been classic Pentecostal or charismatic spaces, so old school Pentecostal or new school Pentecostal, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly. And many of those churches over the last decade or so have kind of pulled toward the Anglican tradition out of which they all came in the first place, which is how I came back to it. And so I was ordained, man, I don't know, 7 years ago, something like that. And then last year, out of the blue, was made bishop of our diocese. And that, has turned my life completely into a snowball rolling down the hill. But that's not really a move away. I mean, in so many ways, it is a change from what I grew up in, but in other ways, it's a deepening of that, right? So I feel more Pentecostal than I've ever been, although the Pentecostals I first knew wouldn't call me one of them
Mhm.
anymore. So that's a bit of it. I mean, lots of intensity early on, but also there was a lack of clarity. There was no real kind of theological depth or clarity. I think it's part of the reason I was so hungry for it. And then I ended up reading my way right back into the roots of my own tradition.
Okay. That's good. That's good. And for you, the rest of you, like, I'm I want to return to that because I think Chris's story resonates with things that you all have said over like the last months in terms of being unsure about or being ambivalent about um, the backgrounds that begat you, and then also I know some of you are also pastoring more working class blue collar congregations. That may seem a far cry from the academies that trained you. So I think um, there are connections there that are worth asking questions about. Um, but Chris, this is a preacher's project, um, and coming up is Easter and Easter tide. But before, so I'd like you to talk about your thoughts on preaching the promise of resurrection. Before you attend to that, I would like I've read a bit of what you've done using Jensen in terms of your understanding of a theology of preaching. So maybe
Mm,
start with your theology of preaching, and then we can get to Easter specifically.
absolutely. Yeah. And I should say, that I can't overstate how indebted I am to Jens on this theology of preaching. I've written a couple of pieces that are kind of easily accessible. Al Kimmel's blog has a piece I did on Jensen's theology of preaching. That's a good kind of, for those who aren't familiar with it, that's a good place to start. But I later read Bonhoeffer's theology of preaching and realized how much resonance there is between the two. But I learned it first from Jens for sure. And the short of it is that preaching is a sacrament. That preaching is Christ addressing His people, and the act of preaching is sacred. It's definitive, central, life giving act for the church and the church's witness in the world. That it happens as the preacher makes the gospel hearable from certain texts. So there's a Jen says somewhere that the kind of the one criterion of good preaching is that the congregation witnesses the preacher struggling to hear the gospel in the text. And I think that gets pretty close to what he believes the work is. And of course, later I would read in Bonhoeffer very similar account. And I don't know, I never had the chance to ask Jensen if he had read Bonhoeffer on this, or if they just, because of their Lutheranism, happened to share this theology. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to track that with other people who've read Jensen and Bonhoeffer. But that that preaching really is about the word of the Lord coming to his people, a word that is gospel, that has concrete effects. Like we hear the gospel and our lives are changed. But that emerges, that gospel is not an idea the preacher has. It's the event that happens when the preacher is grappling with what the texts assigned for that day are saying. Trying to hear those texts as the Lord addressing his people and then bearing witness to that. And, some weeks that's easier than others, I guess. But I think that's really the heart of it. The Pentecostals I grew up with had that intuitively. They would never have phrased it in those terms, of course. But preaching wasn't just, you know, someone sharing their opinions about stuff. We really did believe the Lord is addressing his people, and it was prophetic in that sense. And yeah, I find that I still believe that.
So um, let's get to Easter. Everybody here has to preach on presumably the lectionary passages for Easter Sunday. Acts 10, Isaiah 65, Psalm 118, 1 Corinthians 15, and John 20. And every preacher knows, like, preaching on the Resurrection Sunday is not easy. So give people some handholds.
Yeah, I do think I'm going to, just as a way of sparking conversation, let me say that as a generalization that has all kinds of exceptions, I think preaching is worst where our theology is thinnest. And it shows itself, it gets exposed at funerals, especially funerals that are commemorating tragic deaths, or deaths, Bonhoeffer says we should never call a Christian death tragic, but death that seems to us tragic and untimely. And Easter. So I think around death and the talk of what God has done about death, that's where our theology, generally speaking, is thinnest, and therefore our preaching is weakest, poorest, like most impoverished, and sickest, maybe, is a better metaphor. And I think that means we need much better theologies of resurrection. Not to preach that theology exactly, but for it to shape our imagination in the grappling with the text from which the preaching comes. So I don't think Easter sermons should be lectures. I don't think any sermons should be lectures, really, but certainly not Easter sermons. But I don't know how we get at preaching Easter with anything that's really life-giving in our voices, in our faces, if our hearts haven't grasped some of what is actually being said about resurrection. And that requires reimagining, what exactly we're talking about. Again, this is way over generalized, but I know only one of you on this call, so we'll start here. I think most of us will have grown up in one or another of two environments. One in which resurrection really just meant resuscitation. Like Jesus came back into his body, and we will all come back into our bodies. And heaven will be this life just drained of all the bad stuff, drained of all the poison. But there's like more or less direct continuity between this life and the life to come, between life as we know it now and life as we will know it then, except then it will be an undying life and a life without sin. I think N.T. Wright has popularized the kind of new version of that, right, where there's a lot of continuity between this life and the life to come. And so let's label that conservative, right? On the progressive side, it seems to me, based on the people, I've never really worked in those spaces, but of course I've had friends and have taught in some of those spaces for short bursts. There's a kind of disbelief in that narrative, but no real substantive alternative to it. Right? A kind of mockery of people who believe in that, but nothing to say in response, which, Forgive me, but that's worse. I somehow, right? So this is, I don't think, very life giving, but there is still at least something there. Simply negating that doesn't get us anywhere, except despair. But I do think we need a theology of resurrection that says it's more than resuscitation. There is radical discontinuity between life as we know it and life as it will be, because what's being promised to us is better than anything we know now. And again, I think more or less every page of Scripture makes that clear. I don't know how we miss it. But when Paul says, eyes not seen, ears not heard, it's not entered into the heart of a human being what God has prepared for us. We read that and then go right on to talk as if we've thought it all through quite clearly, actually. Right? We know exactly what's going to happen. And so I think I would start there, Jason, with, like, are we reading theologies of resurrection? Jensen, of course, Rahner are two that I would start with, that are able to shift our imagination enough that we start to feel some of the awe
Mhm.
and wonder, and even, I don't know if dread's the right word, but a sense of something like holy intimidation at the thought of what is going to be accomplished in resurrection. And until we feel some of that, I don't know that our preaching is ever going to carry much more than a report on whether or not we believe the stuff we've been told. And I do think there are times in sermons you have to testify. And I do think there are times in sermons you have to confess. And especially if you're preaching to the same congregation, there need to be moments in which you tell them, hey, this is what's really going on in me. But that can't be all we do. It
Mhm.
can't reduce down to a weekly report from me about the state of my faith, right? Like I can't nourish people from that place. So I think we have to find some way of having a theology of resurrection that awakens in us, that hope against hope. This is, I love Jensen, but I think Rahner has a nuance that Jensen misses. I mean, Jensen is so direct and blunt, and at times you get, he doesn't have a lot of room for people who are struggling to make sense of that. And Rahner is much more pastoral in that sense. He recognizes that this is difficult and will be hard for some people to think through. In fact, in one of his sermons, one of his Easter sermons, Rahner talks about what we need essentially in the Easter liturgy is time for those who have gathered in belief and those who have gathered in disbelief to embrace one another and awaken in themselves again the hope against hope. And I think that starts to get at a nuance I don't think we want to lose. But yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know if this is answering your question, but it's perhaps a gesture toward an answer. Like let's find theologies of resurrection that awaken our hearts to what's actually hopeful, even if it is a hope against hope.
So, so if resurrection is not uh, resuscitation, if it's not Jesus's life just starting up again,
Right.
what before we talked about the specific text assigned,
Hmm.
um, what is the hope that you would push these preachers to grab a hold of?
Yeah. So first, if we can just do a little bit of that theology, resurrection is not the thing that happens to Jesus after he's been dead for 3 days. It's not an event on the timeline of his life. This is absolutely crucial. Resurrection is not one more thing that happens to Jesus after the other stuff has happened. Resurrection is the act of God on the whole of Jesus' life. So, if I'm in a classroom, I just draw a timeline up on the board and say, you cannot plot the resurrection on this timeline. The resurrection is something that happens to this timeline, the whole thing. This is why the Christ who is present is not only present to all people in all times, but he's present in his fullness. He's present as the babe in Mary's wombs and arms. He's present as the child in the temple. He's present as the man on the cross. He's present as the man in the garden weeping. He's present as the resurrected one. Therefore, as the one who's lived the fullness of this life, and in that fullness lived all lives. And we have to grasp that, right? We have to find theologians who help us in our own language grasp that's what's being claimed about resurrection. That human being who had this birth and this death, this timeline that began in Mary's womb and ended in that tomb outside the city, like that man has been made Lord and Christ. And he is, to use a phrase from Rowan Williams, he is the heart of creation, that human being who had that life, that had this beginning and had this end. And resurrection is how that life came to be the source and guide and goal of creation. So, what we're naming in resurrection really is the effect God's being God has on creation being creation. Nothing less than that. It's not one of the things that happens. It is the act of God in which all things are made right and set into harmony and drawn together. And how do you preach that? Right? Like how do you articulate that? And I think you have to have a really clear. Now, of course, there's mystery here, but mystery doesn't mean lack of clarity. Mystery means an abundance so full that even though I'm clear about what is in front of me, that doesn't even begin to exhaust what's there. So, again, mystery is not shadow. Mystery is light, but it's too much light, right? And we can't take it all in. But I do think we have to take in at least this claim that resurrection is not something that happens in Jesus' timeline or on Jesus' timeline, but something happens to it, and that this is therefore the hope of all things. So, what one of the implications of that is that what we're preaching in Easter is not the turning of the seasons. Right? We're not saying, well, we've been through a winter, but spring is here again, as always. That's Easter hope. No, it isn't. That's not Easter hope at all. Right? Easter hope is the full and final setting right of all things, the healing and restoration into unexpected, unanticipated flourishing of all things. And it's not coming back to life or continuing the cycle of life. It is being filled with the life of God. And that has to somehow come through. One of the things, I believe about preaching is what actually reaches people are not the ideas we hold, but what those ideas are doing to us in their witness. And so this is why I think grappling with that theology until your heart responds to it will then show up in the preaching. How could it not? But it without, some kind of straightforward lecture about what resurrection is or isn't.
Mhm.
By
So,
the way,
Chris,
I think 1 Corinthians 15, let me say this real quick. I think 1 Corinthians 15, I learned this from John Baer. It's probably the only piece we have from Paul that really should be labeled Paul's theology. Like everything else we have from Paul really is pastoral response to particular situations. But 1 Corinthians 15 seems to be essentially a lecture from Paul about what he believes resurrection is. And if we read that seriously and honestly, if we actually gave that our attention, I think we would see that he's articulating something that is the alteration of all things. It's not one more event.
So can you point preachers to John 20 and 1 Corinthians 15, which I assume are the two texts that people are most likely to preach? Can you point to those texts and point out things that you would, that you call attention to in terms of
Let me
more
call
robust theology of
I just have them
resurrection?
right in front of me. Yeah. Well, let's start with the gospel, because I think this is, needs to show up in our preaching most of the time. The gospel does. There's so many details in this narrative. The first is, and some of this stuff is obvious, and I'm sure been preached by all of us many times, but I think is worth drawing out to help shift imagination. I've come to believe recently that the most important thing we do as preachers is cooperate with the Spirit, helping people shift their mode of awareness. That what we're trying to do is cooperate with what God is doing to alter their attention to things. And so I think right at the very beginning of that passage, we read that it's the first day of the week, but it's still dark. And this is, I believe, a clue that John wants us to notice that resurrection has happened, but the light's not here yet. Right? So it is morning, but we don't see that yet. And this is, I think, the state of life until the end. Right? That to be someone who believes in resurrection is to say, yes, it still looks dark, but the sun is already risen. And we need to live accordingly. And the this we're introduced to Mary, which this is the first time she appears in John's gospel. So like we tend to kind of smash the gospels together into a fifth gospel and have a backstory for these characters, but John doesn't give us one. He just tells us here's Mary Magdalene without any kind of context, and she comes to, depending on how you read the story of Mary and Martha, but he doesn't make that connection explicit anyway. Come to the tomb, and she sees the stone's been removed, and she runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. And again, we get this sense that she doesn't know. She sees the tomb as empty, but she doesn't know what to make of it. Now think about all the times we've heard sermons. I've preached these sermons about the ways in which the empty tomb is proof of something, but it isn't.
Yeah.
The empty tomb doesn't prove diddly squat, as Oklahomans said. Like, it doesn't prove anything. And to tell people that the empty tomb is proof of something is to suggest that all of this is much more at, kind of easily readable and at hand than it actually is. Like, she sees the tomb as empty, and she immediately goes where any sane person would go. Someone's moved the body, because dead bodies don't move themselves. And okay, and again, I don't know all of you, obviously, or your backstories, but at least the folks that I knew best, that I've known best, like I think there's this naivete that resurrection was just this joyous event in which the disciples find Jesus has beaten death. Glory, hallelujah. Let's celebrate. But the Gospels don't tell that story at all, like at all. Like, that's not what happens. I think we often imagine the resurrection as kind of a homecoming of a friend or a spouse or a child, and catching us off guard, but filling us with so much joy. But that's not the story the Gospels tell. What happens is confusion, terror. There are moments of joy, but then immediately, as in this story, immediately followed by words of either redirection or rebuke. So at the end of this story, Mary, grabs his feet, like clings to him in joy that he is here. And in his word is, don't hold on to me. You can't cling to me. I must ascend. But I think some of what's coming through in this text, of course, a few other details really quickly. She flees to get them. They come running back, Peter and John, let's say, beloved disciple. You get that funny detail about the younger outrunning the older. They get to the tomb. They see that it's empty. They see even that the cloths have been folded, and they believe, at least John does. But what do they believe? Mm-hmm. They go home and they leave Mary there weeping. This is a fascinating detail. Like, we don't quite know what the content is. And the Gospels interrupts itself to tell us they did not yet know what was meant. Right. So the way John says it, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So he believes, he sees and believes. And of course, that's a setup for what's going to happen with Thomas. You've seen and believed, but more blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. But we're told, but he didn't believe in a way that came from an understanding of the scriptures about what must happen to Christ. And then they return to their homes, and Mary stays weeping. And then Christ appears to her, woman, why are you weeping? And she says, they have taken away my Lord. Now, what's again suggested here, right, is that somehow whatever happened with Peter and John doesn't get to her. Peter and John believe something. They go home. They leave her, and they leave her weeping, and they leave her unsure of what has happened with them, but no closer to confidence that something good has happened, right? So the same thing that she said to Peter and John in the beginning, they've taken away his body. She still believes even after they've seen it. And at this point, Jesus addresses her, calls her by name, and she recognizes that he is who he is. And he immediately redirects her. Don't hold on to me. Go to my brothers and say, I'm ascending. My God, my Father and your Father, my God and your God. And so she does. I think the story as it's actually told in the Gospels is just constantly pushing back on our expectations, our assumptions, the way we think the story must have gone, and the way we think the story would go for us. And in part, preaching Easter is having that sense, which your heart is burning, that God is setting right all things, but also to attend to the ways in which it doesn't change much in the world, at least not at first. And somehow all of that has to come through.
And what would you point to in 1 Corinthians 15?
Well, what I said already, that Paul thinks it's silly. I mean, he outright says, "Fool, do you think that the resurrected body is the same as the body that was sown?" And this is where those accounts of continuity, in which we're imagining resurrection as essentially our bodies at their prettiest and firmest, being restored so that we can live life in the future, in heaven, to kind of maximal pleasure and enjoyment. That, I mean, Paul considers that silly, right? That's whatever resurrected body is. It isn't this body given perpetual youth. The resurrection, the body that he says is coming, we can't know what it is, but we know it will be changed, meaning it won't be what we know now, and that it will be changed in such a way that it becomes, like Christ's body, a life-giving center, a site of the Spirit's work. So it's, I think Paul's pretty clear. Like, don't be stupid about this. Like, resurrection is not resuscitation. It's not this body. So there's that really, really lovely John Updike poem, "Let Us Not Mock."
Yeah.
But it's bad theology. It's at least bad in relation to Paul. Because what Paul is saying is that is not that my heart's valves are going to fill again with blood. It's something I can't anticipate, right? And we shouldn't mock God with metaphor, but we also shouldn't limit the resurrection to resuscitation, because resuscitation is necessary in a world that's basic structure hasn't changed. Right? When Lazarus comes back to life, the world remains the world. Everything about the world remains in the same condition it was in before he died. And if that's all we're being promised in resurrection, that's not really the setting right of all things. And therefore is not Easter hope.
That's good. So, Taryn, I'm going to give you the floor to ask a follow-up question.
Why me?
Because I feel comfortable making you go first.
Thanks. Chris, I think my question is, a lot of this is, it sounds like talking about Easter, talking about the theological. Help me, I'm a preacher. I want to know, how do you do this? How do you take it from talking about this life that's different, about eternity? How do you deliver it? You talked about it being sacramental. So how do you imagine taking the step from, well, my guy's fruity. So how do you make this proclamation? How do you move about from theology to the sacramental proclamation?
Yeah. So I think you have to have some sense in your heart of what's being promised is staggeringly good and hard to believe. Again, hope against hope. And if what we're talking about is easily assimilated, then we're not talking about the truth of Easter. You have to have that. And you also have to have some sense of how the way this works out in the world is surprising and mysterious and paradoxical. Again, it's Easter morning, but it's still dark. Peter and John come and believe, but what do they believe really? They leave. Mary's still weeping. She finally sees that it's Jesus and tries to cling to him and is told not to. So I think we have to come with those convictions, and we have to come with our own experience in that season and the experience of the people we're preaching to, if we're pastoring them or living with them. And then this is the part I can't anticipate for anybody. What do you hear the Lord saying in those texts, giving all of that? And I I'm a you're definitely going to get different advice from different people on this, no doubt. But I'm a believer in the idea that a sermon cannot be repeated. That we don't actually preach sermons. We preach the gospel. And what we call the sermon really is an unrepeatable thing, or it should be. So I might even have the same basic outline or text, but I'm not preaching the same sermon. Not if I'm preaching the gospel to these people in this moment. And there has to be something new in what I'm seeing in the text. Not new in terms of a new insight, but a new way in which I'm touched or moved by it. And that's going to be context specific. That's going to be based on what's happening in my life, the life of my family, the people that I'm called to care for, the world. And so I think it's a bit hard to answer because I can't anticipate what that would be for anyone. So I do think there's what we bring to the text and what we bring to the season, and what we bring is that awareness of how staggering it really is, how unthinkable and unthinkably good it is, and also how mysterious its working out is in the world. And then, with honesty, with open hearts, we come to the text and try to hear what is the Lord saying. This year, I haven't even begun to think about what it will be for me, but I can guarantee you, when I'm getting ready to preach this Easter, like something will surprise me, because I will be at a place then in which I'm able to hear the text differently than I can hear them now. And so I think that surprise that comes, that's where the life of the sermon is. So like if I'm preaching a sermon that's scripted out, and I read that to a congregation, I don't think there's any life in that. I think the life comes from how I'm touched this time for these people in this moment by what these texts say. And so I'm not trying to avoid your question, except to say I don't think I can know that for someone else ahead of time, or really at any time, because it's so personal and it's so context specific. But I do, maybe this is the closest I can get to answering your question. I do think the sermon you preach on Easter and the one I preach should feel very distinct. Not that we're preaching different things, we're preaching the same hope and the same texts. But I think what will give them life is that surprise that comes for you in whatever way it comes for you, and whatever way it comes for me.
I think that's not unrelated to. So we all gathered in California in January, and Dave Zoll gave a talk, and one of the points he made was approaching approaching a text where the text meets you in your pain, to start there and to work out from there. That where does this bewilder and surprise and stagger you?
Yeah, I think that is very close to what I'm saying. And if Ronner's Great Church Year, if you guys don't own that book already, everybody should buy it today. It's called The Great Church Year, which is just sermons of his through the year. I mean, through the Christian calendar, through the liturgical year. And he's got all kinds of sermons about Easter. And one of the things that's really striking about it, just sit down and read them. Each one is different, and each one is different in length. Each one is different in tone. Each one is different in points of emphasis, and they actually press against each other. So he'll have a sermon about the glory of Easter. But then the very next one will be a sermon about the ways in which Easter is too much to believe. It's too much to take in. And that was the one I was referencing a moment ago when he talks about hope against hope. And I think if we think about great preaching as something that really has shape over time, over a lifetime with a congregation, all of those notes should be there, right? There's not, preaching Easter is not a few notes, right? It doesn't have a particular aesthetic. It really should touch every aesthetic. So and within every aesthetic, every possible register. So I think there are glorious sermons that are preached, in investments in 8-minute homilies, and there are that are true Easter sermons, and then there are Easter sermons that are, an hour long and sweaty with someone yelling into the microphone, and there are Easter sermons that are tearful and painful, and there are Easter sermons that are hilarious, full of laughter, and there are Easter sermons that are kind of staggering under the weight of what's being claimed about what God is doing and has done in Jesus. So I think Easter is about everything. It touches everything. And hopefully over the course of my preaching life and my life of serving a congregation, they hear it differently each year. It would kill me. Yeah, it would kill me to think that I have a thing to say about Easter, and I just keep saying that same thing.
Yeah, that's I think it's really good because one of the comments, Callie, you have made over the last few months is wishing you could skip over the finding your preacher's voice period and just, launch into maturity, which is one of the things I think Chris is pushing up against. But like Taryn, I also feel comfortable just calling upon you. So, Callie, what questions or thoughts do you have? Laura, you're next, FYI.
Thanks, Jason. I'm curious, in the wandering beauty of your journey through Pentecostalism and the continued in it, as you were talking about the resurrection, not as a moment on the timeline, but the total transformation of time. If the 8th day, that concept has been helpful for you, or
No, I think it's helpful.
come in, because that's when you started saying, I was like, 8th day, so helpful.
Yep. So that's right, and I do think it's a really helpful language. It's another way that I've tried to get at that very thing, Callie, is there's this sermon has been preached in lots of different ways, but the Friday, the whole "It's Friday but Sunday's coming." Are you guys familiar with this language? I will at times on Easter bring that up to say this is one of those staples in Christian preaching that we need to really put away for good. Like, don't say it's Friday but Sunday's coming, for all kinds of reasons. But one of them is this: that does suggest that we're talking about a sequence of events, and that Friday's really bad, but something really good is coming. But that's just kind of basic optimism, and Easter is not about optimism, right? This is, and I heard it first from Hauerwas, but this is what Bonhoeffer means when he says the resurrection does not address the problem of death.
Yeah.
Because resurrection is not the promise that we won't die. It's that we will die with Jesus. It's that we will share in his death, and we'll share in his death all of our lives. Right? The promise of Easter is that I get to share in Christ's death daily. And if I don't hear that as promise, I don't understand the gospel yet. Right? So that 8th day language, I think, is helpful because it pushes back on our notion that, yeah, there are bad things that happen. That's the cross. But good things will come. No. Like that, the good thing that's come is you get to bear the cross always. And the other side of that is that the cross is not a bad thing. Yes, of course, there's injustice there. Yes, of course, it's the worst thing that could happen. We kill God. But it is the way in which he is lifted up and draws all to himself. So Good Friday is not, is not an analogy for where my life is going to hell. Good Friday is the place where God is glorified. And Easter is the vindication of that failure as glorification. I mean, as revelation. So Easter glorifies this man's life that ended in that ignominious death as the truth of God and the truth of every human being. And so I think Eighth Day helps us get there, helps us get that language, helps us get that shift in awareness that I talked about earlier. I at least depending on how I'm feeling on any Easter, depending on how ornery or disruptive I'm feeling, I sometimes will try to draw up. Probably the most absurd thing I did was a kind of Kierkegaardian reverse, where I started off with basically that it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Isn't it good that no matter what bad things happen in our life, God always shows up, and kind of got everybody on board with that idea, and then said, you shouldn't be agreeing with anything I just said. Like, all of that is just naturalist optimism. It's got nothing to do with the hope of the gospel. I was young, and it went okay, but it was probably I wouldn't do it again, not like that. But that, I think, there's a playful way to do that wouldn't be demeaning to people. But I do think that we do need to help shift that awareness somehow with people, that, hey, we're not talking about, don't worry about how bad things are right now, something good will come. That's not the gospel. And somehow we got to do that work in whatever way we can do it.
So, Laura, you're in a setting where you may not be preaching Easter, but you'd be preaching Eastertide. I'm just wondering what thoughts you may have.
This year I'm up. Chris, I co-pastor with my husband, and we take turns on Easter, Christmas. But I got Easter this year, so this is wildly helpful. You kind of started hitting on this in your last section of talking, but one of the things I struggle with is, how do I preach Easter knowing that most people didn't do Good Friday? So they go from Palm Sunday to Easter. We do a little liturgy at the end of Palm Sunday that I love and everyone hates, where we make them the voices of the crowd, and they go from Hosanna to crucify him. And that's how we end Palm Sunday. So we get that much. Most get like 2 sentences of crucifixion. How do you think about preaching Easter when for most people during that week, there's been no crucifixion?
Okay, there's something in your question that there's an honesty in it that is going to allow me to respond honestly. There's a part of me that wants to say, we've got to change that. Like that, of course we have to change it pastorally and patiently, but people ought not be left in a place where they're not able to experience Good Friday. There's a church in the city where I serve. It's a massive church. They actually start their Easter celebrations on Good Friday every year. And I want to just go pick up Stanley and drive him down there and put him in their Good Friday service and let him start talking. Because I think that is hear what I'm saying. Like, I know that contexts require care, so we can't just change the world overnight. That'd be a violence we shouldn't do. But liturgically, we need those days. People need them. And you can't make up for that in other ways. Like if people miss that, they miss that. And you can approximate maybe for a little while, but over the long haul, you can't make up for it. So I think let's just assume that, but then let's talk about, well, what do you do in the meanwhile though, right? Like, what do you do before you get that change brought about? I think I would speak directly to it. Like, this is unfortunate. It is not as it should be that we aren't able to spend these days together, and to spend them with that order: Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Thursday too, and live this with Jesus. But given that we haven't, let's talk about the ways in which Good Friday and Easter, really the whole of Holy Week, is not a series of events, but aspects of the one revelation of God coming to its fullness, coming to a head. And so I think you could, in a sermon, show, that what we get in the Gospels, think about Mark and John, think about how the Gospel of Mark pictures the cross, a darkening that just somehow keeps getting darker until Jesus cries out the cry of abandonment and then screams wordlessly and then dies. Like, does our preaching ever get that dark? Rarely. I think we're afraid for our preaching to get that dark. John essentially does the direct opposite, which is for him. So if I can put it like this, Laura, Mark's gospel makes the cross the intensification of Gethsemane.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Jesus is in the garden coming apart, and it gets worse from there. Cheer up. It's going to get worse. If you think Gethsemane is bad, wait until Good Friday. And Mark just keeps intensifying and keeps intensifying and keeps intensifying, heightening, right? I heard some comedians talking recently about what makes for good sketch comedy. And they said it's heightening and heightening and heightening past the point of anyone's comfortability. And I think that's true of good preaching a lot of times. Like, you just keep heightening it and heightening it and heightening it. So Mark essentially intensifies Gethsemane. And at least on one reading, he intensifies that not just for Good Friday, but for Easter. When the women come to the tomb and the tomb is empty, how do they respond? They flee afraid. So at least for those who argue that the gospel ends at verse 8, the last word of the gospel is fear. Right? So that's Mark's gospel. But we also get John, where, the cross is glorification. The cross is the moment of being lifted up. The cross is the moment in which everything the Father has promised the Son is brought about in the world. So John intensifies transfiguration. Of course, there is no transfiguration story in the gospel. It's the cross. He intensifies transfiguration in the crucifixion, and both are true. And I think one way to preach that would be to draw that to people's attention, to say, these aren't contradictions. There's that wonderful line by Niels Bohr that the opposite of a profound truth is not a falsity, but an equally profound truth. That what is happening in Jesus is both simultaneously darker than any darkness has ever been and brighter than any light. And he therefore has claimed all of that space between the highest height and the lowest low, the brightest bright and the darkest dark. And your life fits in there. And the truth is, and this is where you can kind of bring it home in pastoral way, the truth is, and Callie, you said this at the beginning of our conversation today, there are aspects of your life right now that are dark, and there are aspects that are light. And the truth is, every person sitting in that room, at least every adult, will be able to see, yeah, there are parts of my life right now that are very much places of light, places that are on the mountaintop, places that are where I can see the glory of God in some way. And there are places at this very moment that are also dark and low, and I can see the sorrow, the tears of Gethsemane. And there are, of course, seasons in which one dominates the other, but I would argue that to be human means that those things are always going on. And this is why Paul says, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, because the fact is our lives are always both a weeping, there's occasion for weeping and an occasion for rejoicing, always. And the cross holds them both. And Easter holds them both, because these are aspects of one event. So that's a way, maybe, Laura, to try to nudge them toward, we need that fullness, and we need that time together. Last thing I'll say about this, though, I do think that what's happened to church attendance over the last 15 to 20 years, but really since COVID, has made preaching virtually impossible, because we don't have enough time with people, and therefore we don't have enough time to share some of that fullness for them to get a feel for how much really is there. And again, I mentioned I grew up going to church 4 times a week for hours every time. You get so much time with people, and we just no longer have that. And people, most congregations that I know, the people who attend, even the people who are faithful or regular, don't come every week. So you're not only getting much fewer meetings, you're also getting fewer people attending all of the meetings you do have. And man, that makes preaching so difficult. I hope that was okay, Laura. Thank you for the question.
So we're at an hour. Ryan, I'm going to ask you to close this out with a question or thought.
Well, when you were talking about the resurrection, it made me think of that Hold Steady album, Separation Sunday. And it just follows this character named Holly. At the end, it's revealed that it's sort of like shortened for Hallelujah, and it just kind of follows her down this really rough path. In fact, she asked the priest, like, what would you say to a soft young woman who's fallen on hard times? But anyway, it ends, and she comes crashing in on Sunday morning, and she says, can I tell the congregation how a resurrection really feels? And it just feels like that song is trying to push up against what you're talking about, that it's the resurrection is better and more real than we tend to find the language for, especially when we try to force it. But no, I was just enjoying what you were saying at the end, so I don't really have much of a question.
I don't know the song, but that's
It's
lovely.
good.
That's
Yeah.
lovely.
Dennis?
Yes.
Thought? Question?
I think one question I have is about that you don't want to preach optimism, but I'm also thinking about this, especially from some of the things that I've learned and grown up with in the Black church. How do you deal with people whose lives basically are living in hell now?
Mhm.
Because the way that we talk about this, and I know it's not what you mean, but it can make it sound like it's in the sweet by and by,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we're not going to talk about what's going on now. And I know that's not it, but
No, that's a
how do
great
you
question.
kind of talk about that?
Yeah, that's really, really good. So I think the Pentecostals I grew up with, this was a place where, I mean, they were deeply racist. Make no mistake about that. But in worship, that would melt a little bit. So we spent a lot of time in Black Pentecostal circles and with Black Pentecostals in our circles. And one of the things that I learned long before I had words for it is that there was a difference between white middle class optimism and Black joy. And I think that the difference is when you've suffered and suffered generationally and suffered in your humanity, what you find is the joy is deepest. The song is deeper than all the abuse. But when you are not oppressed and abused, but simply inconvenienced, optimism becomes a kind of narcotic for the discomfort, the disease that happens in a life that's overworked, not abused necessarily, just stretched too thin by schedules. So I think I would want to say absolutely there should be joy, there should be song, there should be dance, there should be a lightness. But what there shouldn't be are platitudes about, hey, things are bad, but it'll get better. That's the difference I'm trying to get at. And what I hear in Black preaching, Black singing, Black testimony at its truest is not platitudes about things will get better, but a kind of sense of no matter how bad things get, there's a light that's deeper than that. There's a song that's deeper than that. And I think one of the ways in James Cone's book or others look at the way in which those songs are about crucifixion so often. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And the effect of those songs, though, is to awaken not despair, not heaviness, not a kind of gloom, but confidence that no matter what's done to us, the Lord remains faithful. And so I think you're asking a really important question, and I think, to try to be as clear as I can here, the problem with optimism is that it's not nearly hopeful enough. That's really the issue. Optimism is a cheap, kind of artificial substitute for hope, and Easter is about hope.
I think, yeah. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, because, yeah. So Willie has his camera off, but I've seen some of Willie's Facebook. Willie has a righteous anger that he, I think it's fair to say that he shared on social media. And I think Easter as vindication versus Easter as optimism. That's a really important distinction.
Yeah, I took that note down.
That's good.
That
Will.
was that was good for me. I apologize for not showing up. I switched to my AirPods, and the app said you changed audio devices, so you're not in the recording.
I wasn't
anymore.
critiquing the lack of video. I was trying to, I was saying that I think Dennis and Chris stumbled upon a handhold for you too. So
Yeah, vindication.
Yeah, that vindication bit. I think I got the quote right. That where was it? I took too many notes. Easter is the vindication of the glory of the truth of God in every human being that we see in Jesus' death on the cross. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it's close enough.
It's close
I think
enough.
it may be better than what I said, but that's what I meant for sure. It's what I was intending.
Okay.
Because I think, there's so many ways to talk about this, but this goes back to Laura's question too about how to help people see that Good Friday and Easter are not opposed events. Right? And this is why it's so important not to talk about it's Friday, but Sunday's coming.
Right.
Because that sets those events in opposition. That, God is doing one thing with his left hand and then undoing it with his right, or doing one thing with his right and undoing it with his left. And what we want to say is, no, this is all one act of God. The whole of Jesus' life is. And here it comes to the head at the cross. The resurrection vindicates that way of living and dying as the truth of every human being.
And I like that because it really provides I want to use the word explanation, but that's right, not right, more of an insight into the way that John's gospel in general speaks about the resurrection or the crucifixion as glory.
Yes.
The glorification of Jesus in John is not the resurrection. It's being lifted to the cross.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And resurrection is what, this is why, if we shift from John to Paul for a minute, when Paul is saying what he wants more than anything is to share in Christ's resurrection so that he can die with him. And again, we don't, that sequence seems wrong to us because we tend to think, oh yes, we die with Jesus, but that's so we can live with him. And Paul will sometimes say, we will reign with him if we suffer with him. But in Philippians, what he says is, I want to know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings so that I might be conformed to him in his death. That's the logic. The resurrection makes it so that I and every human being and all creatures can participate in the way that he lives and dies. And in that way, be conformed to the life of God, filled with the life of God. We've got to be able to practice.
And this is a point I heard you make recently, Chris, or I read you. Too often we tend to distill the gospel into nouns like justification and atonement, salvation, resurrection, incarnation,
yes,
rather than those nouns are really just pointing to a name by which we are saved.
Yes.
And that name is Jesus. And it's the whole life story that we're trying to.
Yeah.
And that's what accounts for Paul saying these things.
Yeah. So Jensen has this wonderful piece in which he says, resurrection is not good news unless you know the name of the one who's been resurrected.
Yeah.
Right? He says, Mussolini has been resurrected is not good news. That it's Jesus of Nazareth who's been resurrected is good news. So I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And so that like that, and it's because it's Jesus that Paul can say like, I want to die with him.
I want to die with him. Exactly. Not
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to die. I want to die with him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a freeing, just thinking about, growing up as a preacher, thinking about having to preach the resurrection could be intimidating because it's hard to find handholds on
Mhm.
that which escapes language, rather than resurrection is an aspect of preaching Jesus.
Yes, that's right. And
That's easier.
that's, well, I don't know that it's easier, but I mean, there are handholds there in that, he has hands, he has wounds, he has a body, and he has a story. So I get your point, but I do think that we have to be careful not to, and I know this is not what you're saying, but I don't think Easter preaching should be easy. I think we should feel, all of us,
Yeah.
feel the overwhelming nature of it. And to tell the congregation we know that, right? Like that, I think back to what we started with Jensen's theology preaching, there is struggle here. I am overmatched. I am overmatched. Every time I speak, I'm overmatched. And I want to be honest about that, and I want to be able to take that with a sense of humor. This is part of what I hear in the foolishness of preaching. We often talk about the foolishness of preaching as what a stupid idea that God would think talking to people would do them any good. But I think the foolishness of preaching is more about be foolish, like be playful, be willing to accept the absurdity of this task and let people see that you revel in it. Like,
So it's like,
I love preachers that love preaching in that sense, that not preachers who love preaching because it gives them a chance to be seen. I don't mean that, but preachers who love the absurdity of it. And I mean, I could talk forever about that distinction, but we're out of time. So,
but there's a freedom, like, encounter the text knowing that you're going to walk away limping.
absolutely. And limping doesn't have to mean grieved or shattered. I mean, there are sometimes reading the text is like, you're overmatched in a painful way, but some of this should be being overmatched in a playful way.
Yeah.
That sometimes we ought to have a sense of humor about the fact that we're talking about God. We're talking about God's action in Jesus Christ, making all things right. Of course, we're not going to be able to catch up to all that. So there's an element of playfulness in all this that I think we need to keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'm skeptical about the internet. I'm definitely down about AI, but I'm glad that the interwebs have made us friends, and I hope the folks here will befriend you online and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's a real honor to get to do this with you, Jason, and give my love to Todd too. Tell him that I said hello.
Yeah, it's good to see you guys.
Pray for me over
See
there.
you
Maybe
too.
your prayers will have more heft if you're praying in the place of the apostles and the fathers. And I need.
I mean, it definitely made an impression that that the gospel is so urgent, or was so urgent, that Ephesus is not like a museum, that it's in ruins.
Yeah.
That these places, that they were too busy to go on to the next place with acid.
Yeah.
To not memorialize these places is really remarkable.
It is remarkable. Absolutely right.
And that tiny little carved out churches in Cappadocia are lavished with detail when they really had no expectation of anyone ever worshiping there besides themselves is remarkable.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I'm here, but thank you for joining us.
We'll talk soon. Oh, and let me know
Thanks,
about
everybody.
the other recording. I know we had to reschedule because of my flight, but just let me know.
Yeah, I'll email you and Stan.
Okay. See you, bud.